Hi, everybody. I'm going to let some people get on before we start. I have to apologize. I'm in the middle of an airport, so I will be handing this over to Amy as quick as I can so that she can get you up and running. But I did want to say welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us tonight. As you know, Amy is our guide from Israel, and she will be handling a tour for you all to Masada today, and I'm very happy to greet her and say hello to her this evening. And just so you know, I will be online, I'll be on mute, and I'll be sharing in the chat and taking care of your questions in the chat tonight, but I'll be sharing how you can tip Amy throughout the presentation and during the Q&A. So I'm going to hand it over to Amy. She's going to take the entire presentation for us today from start to finish, and I hope you have a really great night. Hi, Amy.
So great to be with you again. Thank you so much for having me. I've always enjoyed these presentations with this community, and I am thrilled to be back with you tonight. So a few more people are still hopping on. I can see our room filling up, so I'm just gonna say hello for another moment and give everybody just another moment to get organized. Fantastic to see how many people are joining. There are two functions that you have to be able to send questions to me, which is one is in the Q&A. So because this is a webinar, I can neither see any of you nor can I hear any of you. So the best way to ask a question is in the Q&A. And so hopefully you'll be able to use that, and wonderful to see everybody saying hello in the chat. Fantastic, wonderful. I'm looking at the chat as well, just as we kind of go. And as I said, we're just giving another moment or so just for a couple more people to join us. During the presentation, I won't be looking at the chat, and so I apologize in advance. But you can send a direct message to Mara and the staff who's going to be monitoring their chats to be able to make sure that you can kind of get the answer to your question and make sure that everything is going well. So we are thrilled to have all of you. And as I said, you are going to be joining us now on a virtual tour through Masada, and we'll be talking about the ancient history of Israel and King Herod and all the things that are connected. So I think we're pretty much ready to go. So I think we're going to be able to move on from our initial beginnings. So I am sharing screen right now, so that's the reason that you're looking at the slide that says Masada. And so today we're going to be using a combination of still photography as well as 360-degree photography and maps to be able to tell the story of the ancient fortress of Masada. In fact, the word Masada, the word that you're looking at now, Masada in Hebrew, is in fact the word for ancient fortress. Okay, so the word itself means fortress, and the mountaintop we're looking at in the background of this slide is the ancient tabletop mountain that has been used through the centuries to be a fortress. And so we're going to hear a bit more about why and how that came to be the case. So in order to get us organized, I've actually set us up a little bit with a map. I wanted to show you where we are in Israel. So I'm just going to zoom out for 1 second so everybody can see. This says Israel. Israel is here in the Middle East. That's where I am right now. I'm actually here in Jerusalem. And our two kind of main foci today are going to be we're going to start for a moment in Jerusalem, and then we're going to head down to the south here to where it says Masada National Park. So the land of Israel is bordered on one side in its modern era with the Mediterranean Sea, and on the other side with Jordan. Down south of us is Egypt. North of us is Lebanon and Syria. And so we are here in the midst of, as I said, the Middle East. So I wanted to focus on Jerusalem first for just a moment, because the story of Masada in many ways begins in Jerusalem. We first of all want to understand a bit more about where things were happening more than 2,000 years ago when the story of this ancient fortress begins. And so we're going to head a little bit closer in so we can see the old city of Jerusalem, the ancient old city of Jerusalem. So I'm just going to move us a bit closer to it. This is a modern day view of Old Jerusalem. So I've focused in on part of Jerusalem, which is known as the Temple Mount. So this big rectangle in front of us is known as the Temple Mount. And in the ancient world, the Temple Mount was the site of the ancient temple. Okay, so there was a Solomonic temple 3,000 years ago, and a second temple known as the Herodian temple 2,000 years ago. And that's where our story is going to begin, because King Herod, who lived more than 2,000 years ago, is going to become a major player for us. So we're going to head down now, and we're going to get a better view of the area known as the Western Wall, so I can explain a bit more about what I'm talking about. So 2,000 years ago, King Herod came to this area and wanted to rebuild a temple that had been destroyed centuries earlier by the Babylonians. And now we're looking at today's Western Wall. This is known as the Western Facade, or the Western Wall of the Temple Mount. On top today is the golden dome known as the Dome of the Rock. But in the ancient world, it was the site of the temple itself. That is to say, it was the center of Jewish practice about 2,000 years ago. Today, it's an outdoor, down here at the bottom, it's a modern day synagogue. There's a men's side on the left and a women's side on the right. And this is the ancient Western Wall. It's really all that we have left of the ancient temple. So why was this temple destroyed? What happened over here? So we're going to head to the right a little bit behind this scaffolding to be able to see a bit more about the ancient street itself and understand what was going on that's going to lead us to understand the story of Masada and kind of figure out. So I've landed us just to the right of where we're looking. So we're actually still looking at the Western facade. We're just a little bit farther south than we were a moment ago, and we're on the actual ancient street. Maybe you can see the pile of rocks in front of us that remind us that the ancient temple really was destroyed. But as I said, this is all leading us towards Masada to understand what happened there. So I've got a little box here in the corner that I've been able to add like little pictures. You cannot close that box. So I know that some of you are like, that's in my way, but don't worry, I'll move things so that you can see. There's the wall, there's this pile of rubble here. And sometimes I'll make this box bigger so that you can see what I'm talking about. This is what I wanted to show you. This is a model of the ancient temple from more than 2,000 years ago that was built by King Herod. King Herod was a Jewish king that was working for the Romans. He became king in 37 before the Common Era, BC or BCE. And when he did become king in Jerusalem, then he decided to, as I said, rebuild a temple right here on this area in front of us known as the Temple Mount. So it's this white marble and gold top building that is the actual temple. And the platform it sits on is known as the Temple Mount. And the Western facade that we were just looking at, in fact, is the Western facing wall, which is known as a retaining wall. So what happened here? Why are we going to go to Masada? Jerusalem at the time of King Herod was sort of a powder keg, if you will. There were a lot of internal issues within the Jewish community with disagreements about how to practice their Judaism, how to come to this space and figure out what they wanted to do either here or in their Jewish practice other places. But in addition to the internal issues among the Jewish community, they also had issues with the Romans. By then, the Romans were in charge in this area. And in fact, this fortress that's up in the top left-hand corner is really a Roman fortress overlooking the Temple Mount. There's an ancient historian, and the historian tells us that by the year 66 of the Common Era, about 70 or so years after the death of King Herod, that problem in Jerusalem had raised itself to great heights. And there was such a major problem at that point that eventually the Roman soldiers started to disrespect the Jewish community that was coming to pray here. And it eventually broke out in rebellion in the year 66 of the Common Era. It took about 4 years for that rebellion to gain steam, but eventually this temple was destroyed and this wall came falling down. And that's what we could see now. So I've closed that back down again, and you can see that all of this rubble used to be stones that were sitting up above. But by the year 70 of the Common Era, the temple had fallen and the Jewish community was starting to get dispersed. And that's when a group of them set off to the desert, and they decide that they're going to inhabit that desert fortress that had been originally built decades before them. Now, I know this was a little confusing, so I actually made you a little timeline to show you what I'm talking about. So the timeline is going to show you that in 63 before the Common Era, that's BCE, BCE and BC are the same year. It's just two different notations on the same year. But in 63 before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years ago, this is what we refer to as the beginning of the Roman period. The Romans took over here from an earlier Jewish kingdom known as the Hasmonean Kingdom. And eventually, they're going to put in place puppet kings. And among the puppet kings that eventually becomes ruler is Herod in 37 BCE, Herod the Great. Herod is going to rule from 37 BC, more or less until his death in 4 BCE. So he's already died. The century is going to turn, and more decades are going to go by before, as I said, that major problem happens in 66. Which will lead to the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. And eventually we're going to go down to Masada and understand what happened there. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I've heard the name Herod. I know who you're talking about, but there's more than one Herod. So I put up a bit of a kind of a family tree, if you will, just a little bit of basics to try to make sure that you understand that we're talking about Herod the Great. That's who he's known as in history. He's the son of Antipater, who was an Idumean. And so Herod was actually a very interesting character. He got married, among other people, to Miriam. Miriam came from that Jewish dynasty, and they went on to have several children, including Aristobulus IV, who is the father of Herod Agrippa, who is the father of Herod Agrippa II. Some of you know other versions of the name Herod. Herod had many other wives. I kind of condensed that to say other wives. And many of you who come from a Christian background know from the Christian background, Gospels, another Herod who's actually Herod Antipas, who's the son of Herod the Great. And so that's just a little bit of clarification of the many different people in history known as Herod. So I know that might be a bit confusing, but the person we're talking about right now is Herod the Great. And we're going to keep talking about Herod the Great because he was responsible for an enormous amount of building projects. So we're going to go ahead from Jerusalem, and we're going to head out to the desert ourselves. So I just zoomed out a little bit so you could see again that we're heading from Jerusalem down towards the Dead Sea, and then south in the Dead Sea all the way down to where it says Masada National Park. That's where we're heading to next. Herod initially built here a fortress, which was one of many fortresses that he built over the years, and one of his many building projects. But he built this fortress because although he was working for the Romans, he was Jewish, and he was concerned about threats from both sides, from both the people within the community and people outside of his community. So Masada is actually one of those fortresses. Some of you know that Herod also, as I said, was responsible for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. He built a beautiful port in Caesarea. He built all over the country. And so he was a prolific, massive builder. And so because of the fact that there was a beautiful, wonderful space known as the Masada there in the desert, when revolt did break out in Jerusalem after the death of Herod, the Jewish rebels in Jerusalem knew about this existing fortress. So they went and reestablished it as a fortress about 70 years after the death of Herod, and the Jewish rebels settle in the same place. So we're going to talk about two time periods at Masada. One is, what did Herod build? And the second part is, what did the Jewish rebels do with that space? So let's head a little bit closer so we can go ahead and get ourselves really close to Masada and start our climb up and in. Quick sip of water. Okay, so we're just outside the area of Masada National Park, this tabletop mountain that's in front of us. Let me just show you the desert landscape just a little bit around you so you can see. We're right next to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea, unfortunately, is not a good water source because it is totally salty. That's how it got its nickname, the Dead Sea, since nothing can live in it. But Masada sits right up above it. And actually, it sits very close to sea level itself. The Dead Sea is actually below sea level. Now, I put an insert picture in so that you could see from a few different angles. We're looking at the facade that's facing us right now, which is the eastern facade. And I put up a picture here that we'll look at from the north. Now we're looking at the north. So you can see that the tabletop mountain is relatively, not exactly, but relatively flat here on the top. And more than 2,000 years ago, Herod turned this into a fortress by creating a casemate wall, a double wall all the way around the outside of it. And he built himself a palace right here in the northern part. That's the tip that's facing us. And there's a second palace here on the western facade. There's quite a few other structures that we're going to take a look at it as well. Herod used this more than 2,000 years ago, both as a fortress, but also as a getaway. It's wintertime in Jerusalem, and I'm in Jerusalem now. And Herod, like me, knows that Jerusalem in winter is cold. People don't think about Israel as being cold, but it is. And so today it was icy and cold, and sunny, but icy and cold. And in the desert, just a 90-minute drive or a day-and-a-half hike from here, it's warm and sunny. And so Herod may or may not have ended up coming down here as sort of a winter escape from the cold of Jerusalem. So we know that in addition to trying to protect himself from his enemies by having this desert fortress, which was nearby a rift in the land, which was a potential threat to him, that he wanted to build this. But as I said, so Herod initially built this, and 7 years later, there were Jewish rebels coming from Jerusalem that resettled here. So we're going to go ahead and take a look. So let's head up this path, which is in front of us, which is known as the snake path. This thing that snakes across this place is the snake path, and it heads right up to the top of Masada. So let's imagine in our minds that we've actually hiked all the way up that snake path. You can see it right in front of us, and we've made it together to the top. So from this vantage point, there's the Dead Sea in front of us. We're looking down towards the Jordanian border of today and the ancient border of the ancient world. So we're going to turn ourselves around. That's the modern day cable car that leads visitors up. And we've come up the snake path, and we're going to use this technology to actually enter the room. Let me just turn us right around here. The first thing we're going to do is that we're coming from the outside of the fortress through the casemate wall. So you can see that the casemate wall, the double wall, is actually divided into little rooms. That's what that little room was there first. But we've come through it, and we're going to already be now inside the fortress itself. We're on top of that tabletop mountain. So we're going to use this technology to virtually climb this path together. We're heading up to these walls up above here, so we can see both what is there today and what was there 2,000 years ago. Now, this site has actually been extensively excavated in the modern era. Let me see if I can get you guys a good view of this. I'm not sure if you can see this very, very well, but I'll try to get you a little bit closer. Within this wall, you can see a black line. That black line appears throughout Masada. Because this site has been extensively excavated, years and years ago in the 1960s and 70s, they found everything under the black line, and they've reconstructed everything above the black line. So we have a combination of things that were found and things that were reconstructed here in this space. So we're heading just a little bit forward to get up here. How did Herod build this desert fortress? He actually, let me turn you around for a moment so you can see right next to us is this rocky landscape that people are walking on today. He actually had the Roman soldiers that were working for him that were quarrying stones here in order to build the buildings. That is to say, Herod, the great builder, used the local resources to then create things like this building that's off in the distance and the building that's literally right next to us. I'm actually going to turn us around again, and we're going to head a little bit up the stairs, and we're going to head right into the archaeology itself. All right. Just to our left here is the commander's fortress. I don't know if you can see it. We'll take a quick peek inside. This beautiful fresco that's on the wall here is a reminder that in the ancient world, all of these stone walls were actually covered either by plaster or by fresco. Fresco is a type of plaster that's painted when it's wet. And because of that, when it dries, the plaster is able to hold on to the pigmentation from the paint very well, even for 2,000 years. We often think of the ancient world as being primitive, but they're really not, especially a person like Herod. So this is a little bit of the commander's fortress. Let's go ahead forward. One of the first things that we're going to have to sort out over here is how did Herod actually manage to keep people alive in the desert? The two main things that we need to solve are food and water. So we're not quite solving the water yet, but let's figure out the food. And you can see on the white box on the right that it says storerooms. We're actually standing right now in a reconstructed storeroom from the ancient world. Let's go even farther through it. And I'm going to take you to see that you can see like in front of us. There's one here, and there is a whole line of them next to us. There were maybe 20 storage rooms here at the period of King Herod. Okay, so many storerooms. So what were they storing in the ancient world? They were storing all of the things that people needed to be able to use to live. So if you think about a world pre-refrigeration, what did you need to do? So either they were preserving things by canning, or the ancient version of canning, which is jarring, or pickling things, or dehydrating things, or salting things. And so we have so many ways to preserve food in the ancient world. So much so that Herod's food lasted here throughout his own reign to be able to serve the needs of his entourage and the soldiers that were working for him. But so much so that even 70 years later, when the Jewish rebels came and this place was abandoned, they found viable food. How do we know? I've put up a little showing you about seeds. This is a dried date, and these are date seeds. What ended up happening is that in the excavations themselves, in the actual excavations in the 1960s, they found these viable seeds 2,000 years after Herod had initially put them there. Why do I say they're viable? Because there was an experiment and they actually turned those date seeds into this tree. The tree is grown in Israel's south, and it's a date palm nicknamed Methuselah, which is the oldest person in the Bible. And so this tree gets the nickname Methuselah because it's grown out of 2,000-year-old seeds. So you can imagine that if the seeds were viable to be planted 2,000 years after Herod, that about 70 years after his death, those Jewish rebels found pretty good stuff. So this is a view from above. So I wanted to show you from above that you can see all the many, many different storerooms that are along the way here. Now, not all of them were reconstructed. Again, this is an archaeological site. And so they reconstructed most, but not all of the storerooms. But I keep thinking to myself that, you know, we always look at expiration dates today, but sometimes it's worth it to think to yourself like, hey, if it could last for Herod for 70 years, can it last for us for a little longer than we might have thought? So let us go ahead and keep going forward into our story here. So we're going to move us a little bit forward. It's just rendering for a second, so just give it a moment. I appreciate your patience. Sometimes technology is not quite as fast as we'd love. The storerooms that we came from are behind this wall to the left. So we're taking a virtual walk through the actual site here. So we're spending our first bit of time talking a bit more about what Herod might have done and built. And so I'm going in now into an area which is known as the bathhouse. And you can see I wrote it up here in the place here. We're in the courtyard leading to the bathhouse. So before we head completely inside, I want to show you a little model that was made of the bathhouse. The model I'm showing you is here to our right. That's where it is in the site, but I pulled it up into a still shot so you can see it a bit closer. This the area with the columns is kind of the area that we're in right now. There was a little bit of a courtyard that led into the area of the bathhouse. An ancient bathhouse from the period of the Romans is a really interesting place. It was a place for people to spend time together, to gather, to check out what was happening with each other, catch up on the gossip. And it was divided, in this case, into 4 spaces. So the very first space that people would have walked in, and I hope you can see there's a little doorway down here, is a changing room. So people would have been able to disrobe, take their clothes off, because that would lead them to the next space. From the changing room, people would go into this middle room here at the bottom, which is the tepid room. It is neither hot nor cold. You could acclimate yourself to the temperatures, maybe get a massage, maybe catch up with a friend. And from the tepidarium, the hot, not cold room, then you could take a turn to the side on the bottom left of our screen and go to a plunge pool and cool off. It's known as the frigidarium. The frigidarium could lead you right back into the tepidarium. And from the tepidarium, you would then go into a hot room, which is confusingly known as the caldarium, from the word cauldron, C-A-U-L-D-R-O-N. Caldarium is the hot room. When you were done, you went back to the tepidarium, into the changing room, and put your clothes right back on again. So we're going to actually head inside, and then we'll use our rest of our pictures. So let's take a walk in with this group together with them, and we're going to head right into the changing room. It's amazing to me when I visit here that it's still unbelievable how much of this site is still in existence 2,000 years later. And it reminds us of the technique that Herod used to build. We see more of the frescoes that I showed you a little earlier, that same black line showing us that underneath is things that were found and up above things that were reconstructed. Having said that, the white plaster surrounding the fresco is new to make sure that it stays where it was. I even see these triangle tiles on the floor, which are from the period of King Herod. Now, Herod is Jewish, and at the period of time that we're talking about, we can see indications that he was adhering to Jewish law. What do I mean? He wasn't using graven images. So all of this geometrical design is all in accordance with Jewish law at the time. So we're going to walk right into the tepid room. That's where we are right now. All right, so the tepid room. To our right, beyond that little fence, that's the plunge pool. It's back in the frigidarium. But we're going to head into a very interesting space, which in fact is the hot room, the caldarium. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but the room is really thick. The wall is really thick. I actually put up an extra picture of that so you'd be able to see. Let's go to that for a second. That's the tiles that I was just showing you. This is like a very, very, very thick doorway. And I wanted you to be able to see that so that you could understand that that is how they control the temperature. So let's go ahead right into the hot room. And now we're in this very unique space. Let's move just to the side here so I can, I need to go back. Sorry about that. I want you to be able to see it from all spaces. So here we have one corner of the room and we have a little bridge, and I'm going to turn to the side so you can see a bit more of it. Okay. Above our heads is a vaulted ceiling. So hopefully you can see the vaulted ceiling. I'm going to pull up the stills so I can show you a bit more about what I wanted to. So let's move ourselves just a little bit forward. Okay. The way that the hot room works is as follows. The pillars on the floor are little ceramic posts that held up a secondary floor. That is to say, there was a subfloor at the very bottom, then these little posts, and then a floor that used to sit right on top of it that would have allowed heat to circulate between the two areas of the floor. The heat would have been coming from a fire outside, and it heated up the room. And so that's the way that they were able to do things like kind of throw some water on it. And this is, again, this is the floor that's being held up. So here's the columns and here's the floor that's being held up, and an example of even pipes in the wall on the side that are circulating heat. And so here's a view of the room from behind. Okay, so there's the subfloor, the upper floor, and the space in between them was fed from a fire that's out to our left. Okay, so on the left-hand side was a fire, and it meant that when they dropped water on the floor, the water would turn to steam, it would rise, it would hit that vaulted ceiling and condense, but because the ceiling was vaulted, it would just kind of slide to the sides, going back down again, kind of creating a closed system. So this is a really typical space from the ancient world from King Herod. And I really like this space very much because I think it's going to help us understand their culture and their context. But we haven't mentioned the Jewish rebels in a while. Now, we don't know for sure whether the Jewish rebels used this bathhouse, but it seems unlikely. It a little bit felt, I think, for them, about a little too opulent, a little too much part of the world of Herod. So the zealots were doing other things, and the zealots are the Jewish rebels that we're talking about. So at this point, now that we've seen this area, we're going to head out of this space, out of the bathhouse, so we can start to see also the palace that Herod built. So this is us coming out of this area, and I'm going to move us towards that staircase that's up to our left. Okay, so we're going to make a jump up to that left. Let's do that now. Okay, so now here we are heading towards that staircase, and that's going to help us head all the way to the northern tip of this tabletop mountain so we can get one of the greatest views that are up here. So let's go with this group up to the top. We're just going to walk with them right up here to the top. You can see that the Dead Sea is now out to our right-hand side, and we're facing north right now. So we're heading north right now. So we're just going to go ahead along the edge of this wall so we can get ourselves all the way to the top, all the way to where that guy is standing over there. Yeah, now we see it. Is this not an unbelievable view? Let me show it to you for a moment. This is the view that Herod would have had from the top of the mountain, from his own palace right here at the edge of Masada. Masada meaning fortress. He built himself a hanging palace. That is to say, the palace that we're in right now sits on 3 levels. So let me turn you around so you can see. This top part behind us has not been built up again, okay? But this would have been a covered portico around here at the edge, as well as the top of a palace. So I'm going to pull up a still again to show you a rendering, a model of what the palace might have looked like. It's actually one of the wonders of the world because it's got 3 levels to it. The upper level here at the top where we are now. Let me just move my zoom controls out of my way. And you can see these columns would have held up a portico just like we're standing in now. He would have been able to go down a level into this round level that's beneath us, and all the way down to a 3rd level, which is here. Now, our viewpoint on the model is misleading because all 3 of these levels are at the top of the mountain. It's a hanging palace, which was a kind of unbelievable feat of defeating nature in the ancient world. So let's go ahead back and look at our viewpoint from where we were. So let's just move back for 1 second so you can get a view from both sides, okay? Let me turn you around again. So we're here at this covered portico, all right? Covered portico. Let's go to the end. And if I turn us down, you can see those 2 lower levels, the round level and the square level that's beneath it, okay? I'm going to give you guys also one little foreshadowing that is not connected to Herod, but rather to the Jewish rebels. Eventually, the Jewish rebels were trying to escape all the craziness that was happening with the Romans. But the Romans are eventually going to find out that they're here, and they're going to set up camp. And one of the camps is right out here to our left, and we can see it from here. So we're going to come back to this story in a little while and understand a little bit better a little bit later about what happens with the Jewish rebels and the Romans that were fighting against them. Okay, let's clarify for a moment. At the period of King Herod, the Romans are on the same side as Herod. Herod's working for the Romans. But after his death, Eventually, there's going to be friction between the Jewish community and the Romans. And by the time of the rebels, known as the Zealots, then it becomes the Romans are on the enemy side and the Jewish people are up at the top of the mountain. So it's two different time periods with two different issues. And both of those things are things that we're talking about up here. So let's go ahead and get away from the palace for a second. As I said, it's rendering, so just be for a moment. We move from the upper palace to the lower palace at this point. So here we are in the lower section, and I wanted you to be able to see this unbelievable recreation that they've done. The back is the original, okay? So all of this fresco in the back is original, and here in the front, they've done a little bit of reconstruction so we can see what it might have looked like. How impressive this must have been for Herod's guests. I imagine him bringing his entourage here and kind of talking to them about what it means to be here at the edge. And look, we're at the bottom level of the palace, yet we're really far above the seabed that's beneath us down below. So there's quite a lot of work to be done, as I said, in terms of understanding this place. But the Hanging Palace is, as I said, one of the wonders of the world and one of the things that Herod did. We still haven't figured out, by the way, in the middle of all this, how did they get fresh water? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go and figure that point out next so that we can understand how people had anything to drink. What happened to them? Okay, the bathhouse that we looked at before we went to the palace is where these people are standing. Okay, so we've come, the palace is up to the left, the bathhouse is here, and we're continuing our walk through this site. Right now, we're exiting the area that was the kind of the royal entourage neighborhood. And we're going to go to the casemate wall and the area so that we can understand a bit more about the water cistern and how people got water up here. So I'm going to just move us down the pathway a little bit, and you can see stretching out in front of us the vast space that Masada includes. It's a lot of space. It's actually a lot bigger than it seems sometimes. I mean, if I'm walking fast, I can kind of get across the whole thing in like 10 or 15 minutes, but we never do. We always want to stop and take our time. So let me turn us to the side. I'm turning us back to the west for a moment because I want you to be able to see where we're going next. Let's solve our water problems. One of the first ways that people did things in terms of getting water was they directed all of the raindrops that would fall at Masada into water cisterns. Just beneath us here on the right is a hewn cistern out of rock. So they would have cut into the rock, into the bedrock itself to be able to create a cistern and collected the rainwater. Now, it doesn't rain often at Masada, but when it does, you want to get every single drop. And so I made another little drawing for you. So let me put that up for you for a moment so that you can understand how a water cistern is made. So for the most part, a water cistern has kind of a bell shape to it. So there's like an opening at the top and then a bell shape, which means that it's very strong and people could walk on it. And there would have been a staircase going along the edge of it to be able to reach the water level. So if you had a great winter with tons of water, you didn't need to go down very many stairs to get to your water level. But by the time the summer was over, you were going all the way down to get to your water level, which might have been at the bottom. Okay, so I wanted you to be able to see that a little bit more. And let's just pull that down for a second. This water cistern that's next to us, its roof has collapsed a bit. Okay, so that's why we can see more of it. But I'm going to bring us even closer to the edge because there's a second way that they got water in the ancient world. Herod is known as the great builder because he was very good about technology. Okay, so let's see. I'm just going to move us down to where that group is standing there so that you can see a little bit about what is happening. All right, we're looking out at the side of the desert there. And sorry, that I'm moving you guys too fast. I'm going to move you guys back where I need you to go. Just give me one more moment, everybody. Apologies. Okay, I wanted you to be able to see the side of the mountain for a moment. So it's going to be easier to show you with the stills. So let me go ahead and do that. There is a model here that's showing us what Herod did to be able to direct water to Masada. In the desert, there is a phenomenon known as flash flooding, which means that water, when it rains in Jerusalem, would come through slot canyons in a rush down towards the area of the Dead Sea, which is much lower than Jerusalem. And Herod figured out how to create aqueducts which are these pathways here in the model, and it led to water cisterns on the side of the mountain. So there's an upper one, here's a lower one, and it meant that whenever there was rainwater, he didn't just rely on what was coming on top of the mountain, he was able to harness the waters on the side of the mountain. So I showed you here what a slot canyon looks like. You can look at the top here, like when water's rushing down through these canyons, and you can see even today that the water comes through these places. That is to say that on most of the days of the year, these canyons are dry canyons. There is no water in them. But when water comes, it's because it's been raining, and that is fresh water. Unlike the Dead Sea, which is too salty, that fresh water gets sent into the cisterns on the side of Masada, and it means that people are able to collect the water. So here's a picture of the side of Masada from the angle that we're looking at. So the water would have come from the left through those aqueducts, and along here, I know it's hard to see, but there in fact are little entryways to different water cisterns along the way here that allowed people to actually have drinking water. And that is how Herod managed to make sure his soldiers had water, that he had water in the middle of this very dry desert landscape. So that means when the Zealots came, the Jewish rebels came 70 years later, they too had a water source. That was all well and good. Let's transition a little bit to talk more about the Zealots and what they were doing here. So I'm moving us to the synagogue. It's just rendering. So I'm moving us to a synagogue. Herod, we don't know if he had a synagogue. We're not sure that this was a synagogue at his time, but what we do know is it eventually was used as a synagogue. So let me show you where we were. The water cistern that we were just looking at was to our right, and we've come just a little bit farther here to the south to walk into this room, which is known as the synagogue. This is an ancient synagogue, so it doesn't look like a modern day synagogue. Let me show you around. There are benches on the sides. These pillars likely would have held up some kind of canvas or even wooden rooftop so that people sitting here in the desert would have had a gathering space that wasn't too much in the sun in the midst of this desert. Okay, so it's a very small space. I'll turn us around so you can see there's the entry we just came in. How do we know that a place is what I say it is? We have to look at the archaeological evidence, and it turns out that in addition to us understanding that this was a community gathering place because of the benches, then they also found here remains of ancient scrolls right behind this wall. It's known as a geniza. It's a place where scrolls were placed or put in advance of their burial if something had happened to them. And in fact, today at Masada, it's no longer a geniza, it's actually a place where a modern day scribe sits and writes new Hebrew Jewish scrolls. And so I brought you a picture of the scribe at Masada writing a Torah scroll. So that's what happens today at Masada. All right, so today this is him basically writing Hebrew letters on these scrolls. And I brought you a little thing that he made for my husband and me and my kids. This is my children's names. My son's nickname is Bean, Neve, Amy, Gotti is what it says on here. And that scribe made that for us one day when we were here. And so the reason, as I said, that we think that this is a synagogue is because of the fact that these Torah scrolls were found in this place. And by the way, this is one of the parts of the casemate wall, the surrounding wall in this fortress that actually faces back towards Jerusalem. So we think that the Zealots, those Jewish rebels, came here kind of to get away from the fighting. Now remember, if you will, the timeline that I gave you. In the year 66, rebellion had broken out in Jerusalem. By the year 70, the temple was completely destroyed. So the Jewish rebels were trying to come, according to our ancient tradition, they were trying to come and find a place to live free Jewish lives. So they came here and they settled in a place which had been abandoned. After Herod's death, this place had gone out of use. The Romans didn't need it for their own purposes. And so it wasn't really kept up. And so they resettled here after Herod's death, about, as I said, almost 70 years later. And when they resettled here, they ate the food that Herod put here. They drank the water that Herod figured out how to bring here, and they started to practice their Jewish traditions in places like this synagogue. But as things developed in the area, then the Romans, again, were the enemies of the Jewish people by this point. They had destroyed the temple, the center of our Jewish practice. And it meant that they started to make decisions to also start to stamp out all of the Jewish communities of all of Judea at the time. And so they went from place to place, the Romans, and they took into slavery all of the Jewish community that they possibly could. Eventually, that's going to lead us to a situation here on Masada where the Jewish rebels start to be besieged by Romans. That's when the Romans set up those camps that I showed you a moment ago. There were camps, Roman camps on the seabed level all the way around Masada, all the way around the outside, creating a siege so no one could leave, no one could get in, and that situation lasted for several years. There's an ancient historian known as Josephus, and Josephus tells us that these people here in the ancient world, in the time of these guys, were led by a man called Eleazar ben Yair. And eventually Eleazar ben Yair is going to understand that he's about to be overrun. Let's go ahead forward and understand what decisions that they made. We're going to actually move right along. So let's go ahead and stop here in this space for a second. This is, sorry, I moved myself so fast that this is a second palace. We will take a look at this palace as long as we're here. And we're going to go ahead and up through this doorway. This is a very unique palace. I wanted to stop and show you before I tell you what happens to the zealots because it's so cool. This is an unusual and unique case in many ways of a two-story building in the ancient world. Multi-story buildings are rare, especially for them to be able to be preserved. And so this is just a chance for you guys to be able to see a bit more of it kind of going forward. So I wanted you to be able to see, as I said, kind of a little bit about this. Let's go ahead through this doorway. Yeah, our technology is not working properly, so we'll, here we go. Okay, so we're on the second floor, and underneath us, if you can see, are these unbelievable mosaics. Can you see that down below? So we're standing all the way up above on the second floor in this ancient building. And I just wanted to show you that Herod really did have these like unbelievable mosaics everywhere. Mosaics tended to protect the floor, especially from dirt and grime. And they weren't living, as I said, any kind of primitive life. And let's go ahead and take a look at a second mosaic, which is just beneath us as well. Okay, so this beautiful part of the mosaic that was found over here as well was an ancient living room. And so I think that, as I said, it's a really cool, be able to understanding. And we don't know if the zealots took this over, if the Jewish rebels took this over. I'm using Jewish rebels and their local name, which is zealots, interchangeably. Now let's go ahead and talk about what actually eventually happened to these people once they were surrounded by all of these soldiers. So we're going to head into, we're just back next to the synagogue again, and we're going to head right in here to a room that's right next to us and take a look over the edge as well. So you can see that we're right up above. Remember, I told you that there were Roman army camps that were being surrounded, and that this community was led by, the Jewish community was led by a man called Eleazar ben Yair. So this is another example of the Roman army camps. They're mostly basically walls around the outside. And because the Romans expected to be there temporarily, they didn't necessarily find additional remains of things. So Eleazar ben Yair eventually knew, like I do, that the Jewish communities around Judea were completely being destroyed. According to the ancient historian Josephus, eventually Eleazar ben Yair gathers the Jewish community together, knowing that the end is about to happen. He knows that the end is about to happen because he can see that they've gathered something like 15,000 hostile Roman soldiers in those army camps all around the outside. And those hostile soldiers have spent their time trying to break through to Masada by building a ramp in order to bring a big battering ram and knock down the wall of Masada from the top. And so Eleazar ben Yair, according to the ancient historian Josephus, gives this speech that you're looking at right now. This is a very abbreviated version of it. But Eleazar ben Yair says the following. This is again translated into English, of course. Since we long ago resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind, the time has now come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted against the Romans, and we are the last to fight against them. And I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom. This is a powerful statement. What is Eleazar ben Yair saying to them? He looked around and assessed the options that were led to these people. The Jewish rebels that were on top of Masada numbered less than 1,000 people. There were about 960 of them. Not only were there about 960, they were not all fighters. They were families, the grandmas and the babies along with the fighters. And so he said to himself, we have no way to escape. We cannot escape the siege that the Romans have put all the way around Masada. The year is now 73 of the Common Era. We can't escape. We cannot surrender. Why can't we surrender? Because we can see what is happening beneath us. That within those Roman camps, we can see other Jewish communities that were taken into slavery and not being allowed to practice their Jewish religion. They're not Jewish anymore. Now they're slaves. And surrendering would mean that we lost our Jewish practice. Okay, why didn't they stay and fight to the death? And I think it's the same reason. They knew that not everyone was going to be able to fight, not the children, not the grandparents. And so what he's saying to them is that in this last line, he says, it's still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom. It's another way of saying we are going to choose to take our own lives. In Masada, in the excavations, they eventually found these pieces of pottery that you're looking at. They're known as astrakhan. An astrakhan is a piece of pottery with writing on it. And among the ones that are here, they say different names on them, including the name Ben Yair, Eleazar's last name. He was the leader. And we believe that they drew lots to decide how they were going to take each other's lives. So that some people were tasked with taking the lives of the rest of the community. And the tradition says that Eleazar ben Yair was tasked with taking his own life. They knew that the Romans were about to break the siege. I'm showing you a view from the western facade. Can you see that there's kind of a spur on the mountain here? This spur on the mountain meant that the Romans were on their way to getting all the way to the top of the mountain in order to be able to bring a battering ram and to be able to break through. And so in that case, they had no options left. By now, the year 73 of the Common Era, and by all accounts, the rebels had been here for 3 years trying to preserve their Jewish tradition. And it's in that case that they, in fact, eventually decide, as I said, to take their own lives. Now, coming back here, we can see that this is the Roman army camp in front of us. Hidden from our view down below to the left is where that spur is. So let's go ahead over to the spur for ourselves for a moment. And so we're going to see if we can get just a little bit closer to the edge there so that you can see too. Okay, so the spur, as I said, it's a little bit difficult to see in this angle, but it's just down below us, leading to this parking lot that's down below, modern day parking lot. But you can see from this western facade that the Roman rebels were really on their way up. I often imagine to myself what Eleazar ben Yair must have been thinking in that moment when he took his own life. He thought that he was taking the life of the last free Jewish person in the world. Unbeknownst to him, there were other communities outside of the land of Israel that, of course, did have Jewish people that were thriving in other places. He also didn't know about a tiny Jewish community that had a school that started here in the land of Israel. And that school eventually will grow and grow back into a thriving Jewish community in the land. And so the the Romans were not successful in stamping out all of a Jewish life. They really weren't. And in a lot of ways, that's the struggle that we face today. That being here at Masada is going to mean that we're going to always struggle with this question of how do we avoid the problem of being in a situation where we're surrounded by hostile enemies. What options do we have? So we often will head at the end of our Masada tours to go to this location at the very southern tip. And at the southern tip, we'll often shout out into the distance the following words, Shenit Masada lo tipol, which means Masada shall never fall again. And it's a metaphor for us to be able to say that today we won't ever be in a situation to be surrounded by hostile enemies and not allow our voices to be able to be ones of looking forward, which is particularly timely now here in our land. Now, I brought up a little video so that you could hear what the echo sounds like. So this group is going to yell out the word Masada, and you'll hear it echoed back from the canyon so that our words become mingled with the mountain itself and with the words of 2,000 years worth of people. Let's see if we can hear it.
Let's do it a little bit shorter. Let's just shout Masada all together, not staggered. Everybody shouts together and then nobody makes any noise. 1, 2, 3.
So that's a great, fantastic image. I wanted to bring this up to you as well. Today, Masada is home to many, many bar and bat mitzvahs, the coming of age ceremonies for men and women or boys and girls that become 12 and 13. This specific picture is actually my cousin and my dad. My dad is a rabbi, among other things, and this is my cousin who decided that she wanted to be bat mitzvahed in this place. And I love this picture because it reminds me of our thriving Jewish tradition here in the land of Israel and until today. That it's something that we can think about and say to ourselves, although the Romans tried their best to get rid of us 2,000 years ago, we managed then and we will manage now. Today, we think of Masada as a place, as I said, of hope, of something that reminds us always to try to find a way to negotiate, a way to think about the future, and a way to think about our connection to our ancient past, of Jewish heroism in the ancient world, of the story of Herod himself who built this place. And so I really hope that you enjoyed your tour here of Masada. I'll face us back to Masada itself. We'll go back this direction for a minute. And I appreciate everybody so much for sticking with us all the way till the end. And I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everybody so much. And I'm going to go ahead and look at the questions and start to answer the questions. And
While
thank
you're
you so
looking
much.
at the questions, Amy, I'm going to say thank you very much. I'm chiming in from my layover in the Atlanta airport as I'm on my way to Rome. It's funny that you showed that picture of your dad and your cousin because so many people in the chat have said the same thing. And I spoke with someone earlier today who said they were bat mitzvahed at the Masada. So it's neat to see that that's a tradition for so many. So yeah, if it's okay with everybody, I have put up, or Amy has put up a slide for me. It gives you the instructions on tipping, Amy, if you enjoyed the presentation today. It also gives you a list of our upcoming physical tours. And I have put in the chat and the Facebook feed how you can tip the tour director. So Amy, if you're ready, you can take us right into the Q&A and go from here.
Thank you so much. And thank you in advance, everybody, for tips. That's awesome. I got a question about the book, The Dove Keeper. I love the book, The Dove Keeper, and it is also definitely refers back to Masada. So if you're looking for a fiction book that talks about it, The Dove Keeper is a great one. The ancient historian that I was referring to is called Josephus Flavius. Josephus Flavius. And he wrote an ancient book called The Great Revolt. Okay, that was the second question. I had a question about how did the Romans build their attack ramp to Masada, but how did Herod get all of his stuff up in the first place? Like, how did all of his materials get up? So first of all, most of the materials came from the building itself, came from inside their, inside Masada, like they just quarried the stones. But he had the use of all of those Roman soldiers to carry things up and down the snake path. So that was the way they did those kinds of things. Were there roofs on those storerooms? We think so. There isn't definitive proof one way or the other. Things are stored in jars as well. So I believe there were roofs, but I can't say definitively. Were the ancient Roman baths houses only for men? Yes, absolutely. They likely had times that were specific to women, but for the most part, they were for men. And so that's the 2 questions I got out about baths. Were the frescoes deliberately covered over? Okay, here's the thing for whoever's asking about frescoes. Frescoes and plaster were used in the ancient world to be able to beautify stone walls. Again, we always think about the ancient world being very primitive, but it was actually very beautiful. So today they weren't covering the plaster with white plaster of modern era. Like the white plaster that you saw today was just on the walls to help hold up the existing fresco. So they didn't cover anything, they just added to it. Okay. I got a question about when archaeology starts in this area. So it was, generally speaking, popularized at the end of the 1800s, as you wrote to Carol, who wrote to me this question. But in Masada specifically, most of the excavations only begin in the 1960s. Although we have the Palestinian Exploration Fund, which came out of the UK, out of Britain, already in the early 1900s. So there's an enormous amount of excavations that have gone on in general in the land of Israel from the early 1900s all the way until today. Okay. Would there have been a pathway inside the top portion of the palace to reach the lower level, or did they have to use the outside stairs to reach it? They definitely needed to use an outside staircase. If you kind of are looking at the slide that's up right now, you can see the northern palace, and the staircase went around and down to the outside, which meant that it's unlikely that the zealots were using it during the same period of the Roman siege. Herod must have had some, this is my question, Herod must have had some amazing civil engineers and architects. Did we know anything about who actually designed these wonders, or was Herod himself the genius? Okay, Claudia, thank you for your question. I like to think of Herod as the ancient version of Steve Jobs. Okay, Steve Jobs of Apple has like a vision about all sorts of cool things that Apple needed to create, and then the engineers had to figure out how to make his vision come true. So Herod was the visionary, and he had people basically working for him and solving those problems, how to create a hanging palace, how to create a, temple on top of a mountain in Jerusalem, how to create a port in Caesarea. So there's like lots of those kinds of things. Somebody else asked about how people got around on top of Masada. It's not quite as big as it looks. Like definitely people were just walking on Masada, and most people were walking between Jerusalem and Masada. It's like a day and a half or so hiking. Okay. How long did it take to build the spur? Okay, so Jody, thank you for your question. The spur that the Romans were using to break the siege on the Jewish rebels, according to Josephus, the ancient historian, it took 3 years from the destruction of the temple in 70 until 73. The problem is that we can't always believe Josephus. There is no version in the ancient world of fact checkers. And so he sometimes stretches the truth. And today's archaeologists believe it was a question of several months because so much of it was already a spur. Okay. Is there a columbarium here? And did Romans burn their bodies? Those are 2 good questions. The word columbarium comes from the word columba, meaning pigeon, or dovecote. There are dovecotes on Masada, also known as columbarium. There are dovecotes. They may have been used for a lot of different purposes, potentially just for raising pigeons for food, maybe carrier pigeons, maybe not, lots of reasons. And that's one of the questions. Somebody else asked about the Israeli army taking their pledges today on Masada. Yes, the Israeli army will often use Masada to bring soldiers at the end of their basic training or a part of a course to be able to come and finish that ceremony by repeating those ancient words again about Masada not falling. It goes to a long-standing Jewish tradition of connecting back to our ancient history to try to understand today's existential issues with our existence. Thank you, Sharon, for your comment. And can somebody today hike up the snake path? Yes, I don't like doing it, but I can. And so it takes me, who's a slow hiker, about an hour. Fast hikers can do it in about 30 minutes to be able to do this. Fantastic. Somebody asked me, Natalie asked that, and thank you for your comment, Natalie, as well, that in the end, there were survivors among the Jewish people. Now, I didn't want to get too much into the weeds, so I didn't talk about this, but according to Josephus, our ancient historian, there were a few survivors of this self-massacre. And those few survivors are the ones who relayed back to the Romans and to Josephus the speech that was given. And so it is something very nice to be able to kind of understand that there were some survivors after all. Somebody is saying that the miniseries is available on some streaming platforms. I highly recommend that you go ahead and look for that. Can I repeat the memorial Hebrew saying? Yes. Gregory, thank you for asking. In Hebrew, it says, Shenit Masada lo tipol. Masada shall never fall again. Shenit Masada lo tipol. And yes, there was a movie that came out that was the Masada movie, fantastic movie. Peter O'Toole really was the Roman commander. It was a great movie. So somebody who went to that. So fantastic for everybody. Lots of people making very nice comments here in the questions. Where did the Zealot family stay? Were there other small buildings? We believe that the Zealots probably were using, for the most part, the casemate wall. So the wall that went around the sides of Masada, rather than the palaces themselves, were also used by the Roman soldiers when they were guarding Herod 70 years earlier. And likely that's where the Zealots ended up. But yes, there were a ton of buildings that we just didn't visit today in the context of our virtual tour, but so many other places to visit here as well. Is Masada, another question here from Rita, thank you, Rita. Is Masada in the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found? So Masada is about an hour drive south of where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found. The Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient scrolls more or less from the same time period as the destruction of the temple, more or less, and this major revolt. And they are a whole series of scrolls. Maybe we'll do another presentation on that another day, but yes, not too far away. Fantastic. Thank you, guys. I think that's it from those part of the questions. Let me go in the regular chat and look here. Just making sure. Oh, one more question. How many people do I think or know that Masada could house at one time? So at the period of the Zealots, we know that there was at least 1,000 people, and probably at the time of Herod, it's hard to say how many more than that, maybe double that or something along those lines. Fantastic. There's so many nice comments here. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. I'm just looking through here to the chat to see if I can grab any more questions. Oh, here's one. How did they make the cold room cold? So the water itself, and somebody else actually also asked about the rainwater being a drinkable. So first of all, yes, the rainwater is drinkable. Again, they did their own ancient version of filtration. As soon as the water is within the context of stone walls around it, it just keeps cool. The bigger issue is how to heat it rather than how to keep it cooler. In the summertime, when it gets very hot, as long as it's inside like the area, like the mountain itself, that it stays very cold. So it's all good. Wonderful. Fantastic. I'm just looking through and appreciating all of your comments while I look for additional questions. Thank you, everyone. So Holly, congratulations on your bat mitzvah when you turned 50. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yes, and somebody met the rabbi that is the scribe, and somebody was inside there. Yes. And just to be clear, Cindy, thank you for your comment. The bathhouse was definitely Roman and definitely not Jewish. We all agree on that. It was a Roman installation, and the zealots are unlikely to have used it, but we don't know for sure. Fantastic. All right. All right, I think that's it for the questions. It looks like all the rest of the questions taking place. Thank you all for your thoughts on what's going on today. We, of course, only pray for peace and going forward and all of the things. It looks like a few more questions came up in the Q&A. And thank you for everyone. You've been a wonderful audience today. A couple more questions came in. Let's see. When did they put the guardrails in? So they've been putting guardrails over the last like 20 plus years. And so if you were, depending on how long ago you were at Masada, the guardrails have been like, so like, they just keep adding them all the time. That's part of it. And which Herod presided over Jesus's trial? So actually it was not Herod that presided over Jesus's trial. That is about Pontius Pilate, which was the procurator at the time. Wonderful. I think we're good on questions. Thank you guys so much. It's actually like 1 o'clock in the morning here in Israel. It's 1:10 in the morning. So I'm just going to stop the share so I can see our faces.
Thank you so
Sarah,
much,
thank
Amy,
you so
for joining us. I'm so glad that you were able to come and join us even at this late hour. So I appreciate it, as it does work for most of the people in the United States anyway, or in North America. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it. This Zoom has been recorded and it will be up on my website, Girl Travel Tours. If you have not seen it in its entirety or you want to share it with a friend, come back tomorrow and you'll see that up there. Thanks, Amy. Have a good night. And to everybody else, have a good day. And we'll see you on the next virtual tour. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.